They wanted to create a modern and independent European nation. They authored profound novels, staged plays, pioneered a new theatrical language, passionately debated the future of their culture, and believed that Ukraine had the absolute right to speak with its own voice. But then Moscow decided this voice was far too dangerous to be heard.
I truly see it as a very deliberate course has been set to completely destroy me as an artist.
Today we will talk about the executed Renaissance, about a generation that could have changed Ukrainian culture for decades to come. It is a story of how the Soviet authorities initially permitted and encouraged Ukraine to flourish, and then began to systematically and methodically uproot this blossoming. And about why the names of Kvilovi, Kurbas, Kulish, Pidmohilny, Semenko, and others are returning right now, when Ukraine is once again fighting for the right to be itself. Before we begin, subscribe to the Focus channel, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because the stories that were nearly erased for decades deserve to be heard loud and clear. On June 22, 1933, a new wave of arrests targeting representatives of the Ukrainian intelligentsia began in Soviet Ukraine. For many writers, scholars, teachers, and artists, this day marked the beginning of a path leading to prisons, labor camps, or death. Officially, they were accused of nationalism, counter-revolutionary activity, and participation in fabricated anti-Soviet organizations. In reality, the Kremlin began systematically eliminating a generation of people who were creating modern Ukrainian culture. These arrests were neither accidental nor isolated acts of repression. They became part of a large-scale assault on Ukrainian identity, unfolding in parallel with the Holodomor. If Ukrainian peasants were broken by famine, then the intellectual elite were crushed by repressions. The particular cynicism of the situation lay in the fact that just a few years earlier, this very government had encouraged the development of Ukrainian culture. In the 1920s, the Soviet policy of Ukrainization opened up new opportunities for writers, directors, artists, and scholars. It seemed that after centuries of prohibitions, Ukrainian culture had finally been given a chance for full-fledged development.
It was precisely thanks to the policy of Ukrainization that many cultural figures and scholars who had previously left returned to Ukraine, even Mikhailo Hrushevsky himself. Most of them were later destroyed.
It was during this time that a generation of artists emerged, which we now know as the executed Renaissance. They believed that they could create a new European Ukraine, modern, educated, and culturally independent. However, by the early 1930s, Moscow had reached the conclusion that such a Ukraine posed a threat to the Soviet Empire.
There was this idea that all this Ukrainization was being carried out exclusively to identify who among the executed Renaissance and later among this group of artists and poets was involved. These creative artists, who frequently occupied more prominent national positions than communist ones, as if to identify which are Ukrainians and later repress them.
To understand why the Stalinist regime declared war on the Ukrainian intelligentsia, it's worth going back several decades. After the revolutionary events and the defeat of the struggle for independence, it seemed that the Ukrainian cultural project was doomed. However, it was precisely in the 1920s that Ukraine unexpectedly experienced one of the brightest periods of its cultural development. The policy of Ukrainization, which the Bolshevik authorities implemented as part of a broader campaign of indigenization, opened up new opportunities for the development of the Ukrainian language, education, literature, and art. The Ukrainian language was being increasingly introduced in schools, government institutions, and the press, and the number of Ukrainian language publications was rapidly growing. New theaters, literary studios, and artistic associations were opening in major cities. Within a few years, an entire generation of young authors emerged in Ukraine, striving to create a modern culture on a European level. They translated Western writers, experimented with form and style, debated the future of Ukrainian literature, and sought their own place on the cultural map of Europe. It was during this time that writers such as Mykola Kavilovi, Valerian Pidmohilny, Yevhen Pluzhnik, playwright Mykola Kulish, director Les Kurbas, and dozens of other artists made their mark, names that today have become symbols of an entire era. They were firmly united by the deep-seated conviction that Ukrainian culture should not be a provincial appendage to Russian culture, but must develop as an entirely autonomous European phenomenon. A special place in this process was held by the Berezil Theatre, which was founded by Les Kurbas back in 1922.
Let me say right away that this artistic association, Berezil, was in fact not a theatre. It was truly an association of a vast multitude of studios, many people with diverse and varied artistic backgrounds, and not only people from theatrical professions, but also artists, photographers, dancers, and various circus performers. To put it in another way, people from many different artistic professions with unique sets of artistic skills and talents.
His productions impressed contemporaries with their innovative approaches, and the theatre itself is often compared to the boldest avant-garde stages of Europe at that time. At the same time, heated debates were taking place in literature about the path of development for Ukrainian culture, the most famous of which was the literary discussion of 1925 to 1928. It was at that time that Mykola Kvilovy called for orienting towards European culture rather than Russian models. Today, historians refer to the 1920s as the Ukrainian cultural renaissance. However, it was precisely the success of this generation that later became one of the reasons for its tragedy. The more prominent Ukrainian cultural independence became, the greater a threat it seemed to the Kremlin. And by the end of the decade, the policy of support began to give way to a policy of control and repression. When speaking about the executed Renaissance, it is important to remember it concerns not only writers. It was an entire generation of intellectuals who tried to create a modern Ukrainian culture, from literature and theater to cinema, science, and education. One of the symbols of the era was Mykola Kvilovy. His pamphlets and journalistic works sparked heated debates about the future of Ukrainian culture. It was Kvilovy who coined the famous slogan, "Away from Moscow," urging Ukrainian artists to look to European cultural traditions rather than copying Russian models.
Thus, the slogan "Away from Moscow, align with psychological Europe" was twisted by the Czechists into "Align with bourgeois Europe," shifting it from an aesthetic and psychological context to a political one.
No less significant a figure was Les Kurbas. The theater he founded, Berezil, became one of the boldest artistic experiments in interwar Europe. Kurbas combined innovative stage solutions, avant-garde approaches, and social issues, creating performances that were ahead of their time.
As a passionate artist and idealist, Kurbas sincerely believed that through theater, as well as art in general, he could reshape the human psyche and create a dedicated audience, a person of firm character, a pure enthusiast, a person of the 20th century.
Alongside him worked the playwright Mykola Kulish, whose plays became the foundation for many of Berezil's productions. In his works, he raised questions of Ukrainian identity, social change, and the conflict between the old and the new worlds.
Kulish was truly a man of exceptional formal education and impressive self-education. He possessed a comprehensive knowledge of classical and modern literature, and he fluently spoke several languages and regularly read in many others throughout his entire career. He was well versed in music and played the violin himself.
Among the most outstanding prose writers of the generation was Valerian Pidmohilny. His novel, The City, is now considered one of the first Ukrainian urban novels, which depicted the life of a big city through the eyes of a young person striving to find their place in a new reality.
Pidmohilny worked as a teacher, worked as a translator, and published his first collection when he was barely 19 years old. And he even gave it the telling title Works, Volume 1, subtly hinting that the release would be successful and that a second part would inevitably follow. And all this despite the fact that he never received a higher education. He only finished vocational school.
The poet-futurist Mikhail Semenko also played an important role, striving to integrate Ukrainian poetry into the broader European avant-garde movement. His experiments with form and language posed a real challenge to traditional literature.
Mikhail Semenko was opposed to classical literature. He founded the Futurism movement in Ukraine.
However, these people were just the tip of the iceberg. Alongside them, dozens of poets, artists, translators, educators, historians, and scholars were also at work. They created new schools, magazines, theaters, translated world classics into Ukrainian, and formed an intellectual environment that could have become the foundation for the development of an independent Ukrainian culture. That is why the repressions of the 1930s struck not just at individuals, but at an entire cultural environment. The Soviet authorities essentially tried to destroy the people who were creating an alternative vision for Ukraine's future. The cultural renaissance of the 1920s did not last long. By the end of the decade, the Soviet authorities began to roll back the policy of Ukrainization, and with it, the space for creative freedom. What had been encouraged by the state just yesterday was suddenly labeled as nationalism, and artists were increasingly accused of anti-Soviet activity.
And everything that began in 1930, from hate speech in the press, from, let's say, these labels that were attached to the Ukrainian intelligentsia, claiming it was counter-revolutionary, that it was some kind of nationalist terrorist organization, and they will simply spill out en masse into the space of the media documents, archival criminal cases already in the second half and at the end of the 1930s, and in fact directly during the years of the Great Terror of 1937 to 1938.
One of the first alarming signals was the fabricated case of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine in 1930, within which dozens of Ukrainian scholars, educators, and public figures were arrested.
In total, by the spring of 1930, more than 700 people had been arrested. Direct orders regarding the preparation of the trial were issued by Stalin and Kozyr, both general secretaries, Stalin of the Union and Kozyr of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Bolsheviks. For the public trial, as already mentioned, 45 people were selected. More than half of them were well-known representatives of the Ukrainian intelligentsia. Let us name a few of them. Volodymyr Chekivsky, former Prime Minister of the Ukrainian People's Republic, Andriy Nikovsky, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Ukrainian People's Republic, Lyudmila Staritska-Chernyakivska, a writer, public figure, and daughter of the classic author Mikhailo Staritsky. Josip Hermeize, professor at the Kiev Institute of Public Education, historian. Volodymyr Dordudivsky, linguist, literary scholar, and educator. Maria Tobilevich, translator, writer, theater figure, and daughter of Ivan Karpenko-Kary.
However, the real blow to the Ukrainian intelligentsia came in 1933. In May, after the arrest of his close friend and associate Mikhailo Yalovyi, Mykola Kvilovy committed suicide. His death became a symbol of the collapse of an entire generation's hopes. And already on June 22, 1933, a new wave of arrests of the Ukrainian intelligentsia began, which effectively marked the start of large-scale repressions against cultural figures. The following years became a catastrophe for Ukrainian art and science. Writers, directors, artists, scientists, and teachers ended up behind bars. Many were sent to the camps on Solovki. Some of them never returned home. The culmination of the tragedy came on November 3, 1937, when in the Sandarmokh forest in Karelia, Soviet punitive authorities executed more than 100 Ukrainian cultural figures. Among them were Les Kurbas, Mykola Kulish, Valerian Pidmohilny, Pavlo Filipovich, Mykola Zerov, and other representatives of a generation that, just 10 years earlier, had dreamed of a cultural revival in Ukraine.
During the mass executions at Sandarmokh, the totalitarian Soviet regime tested all possible methods, let's say, of managing and controlling political prisoners that would later be widely used throughout the network of Gulag labor camps, how much meager food to give them, how to use them for forced labor, in what harsh conditions to keep them, and even which brutal tortures to apply. and later every one of these specific methods became the standardized and routine practice for many consecutive long decades in Soviet concentration camps.
It was precisely after these events that the term executed Renaissance ceased to be just a literary term. It became a symbol of a generation that tried to create Ukrainian culture but was almost completely destroyed by the Soviet authorities.
The term executed Renaissance was not only coined, but also spread among a certain audience. And this term was coined by Jerzy Gidroich, and he described it in a letter to the Ukrainian literary scholar Yuri Lavrinenko. This happened on August 13, 1958.
History does not know the subjunctive mood, but in the case of the executed Renaissance, the question of lost opportunities inevitably arises. The Soviet authorities destroyed not just individual writers or directors, but cut short the development of an entire generation that could have defined the cultural direction of Ukraine for decades. At the beginning of the 1930s, Ukrainian literature, theater, and art were undergoing rapid development. The works of Valerian Pidmohilny, Mykola Khvilovi, Mykola Kulish, and Yevhen Pluzhnik demonstrated that Ukrainian culture was increasingly engaging with broader European intellectual movements. At the same time, Les Kurbas's theater was already being called one of the most fascinating artistic experiments in interwar Europe. According to many researchers, if this generation had not been destroyed, Ukraine could have established its own powerful cultural institutions, humanities schools, and artistic traditions much earlier. Instead, after the wave of repressions, a void was created that had to be filled over decades. In fact, the Soviet authorities deprived Ukraine of the natural development of its intellectual elite. The generation that was supposed to pass on its experience to its students to nurture new artists and scientists was almost completely destroyed or forced into silence. The consequences of this cultural rupture were felt for many decades after the end of the Stalinist era. That is why the executed Renaissance is perceived today not only as a page of tragic history, it serves as a reminder of how high the price can be for attempts to destroy culture and national memory. Despite the Soviet authorities' attempts to erase the memory of Ukrainian artists, they were not able to do so completely. Some works were preserved in archives, while others were taken abroad. And after Ukraine regained its independence, many names returned to the cultural sphere. Today, the works of the representatives of the executed Renaissance are included in school and university curricula. Les Kurbas's productions continue to inspire contemporary directors, and researchers are uncovering new pages in the history of Ukrainian modernism. Archival research after Ukraine gained independence played a special role in restoring the memory of repressed artists. The opening of documents from Soviet security services made it possible to restore the fates of many people who had been deliberately erased from history for decades. Almost 100 years ago, the Soviet authorities tried to convince society that these writers, directors, and scholars were enemies. Today, they are symbols of Ukrainian culture and a reminder that the struggle for the right to be oneself often begins not on the battlefield, but in books, theaters, and university lecture halls. June 22, 1933 became one of the days when this struggle entered its most tragic phase. However, even mass arrests, executions, and decades of silence could not completely destroy what the generation of the executed Renaissance had created. Today, their voices are heard once again, and perhaps this is their greatest victory over the system that sought to condemn them to oblivion. Write in the comments which works from the generation of the executed Renaissance touched you the most. Like, subscribe to Focus, and turn on notifications to stay in the loop of events.